Festival of India is designed to celebrate Indian heritage, but with a very clear focus on how it can help us drive the future. We really want the world to know that the age of Indian ideas is now here. Ideas from our past, ideas from our present, and ideas for our future. India is well on its way to reclaiming its place in the world order. Of course, we have many, many challenges. And it's here that if we actually look towards our heritage and our history, there are solutions to be found. And this is what the Festival of India wants to celebrate. We are celebrating Indian ideas. And just for that, we have Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, an eminent thinker and writer, who is also the principal economic advisor to the Finance Ministry of India. Sanjeev will tell us about his idea of the Indian in Indian Ocean. Sanjeev, please.
There's been a lot of controversy recently, as many of you are aware, about how Indian history is represented. And most of the discussion tends to be about biases that have crept into the narrative from colonial, Nehruvian, or Marxist sources. But there's another bias, which is not usually talked about, and which is this, that most of Indian history is usually related from the perspective of Delhi. And much of our, so it's very likely that in your textbooks you learned about obscure dynasties like the Lodhis, who ruled over Delhi, but not about major empires like the Vijayanagar Empire, or the Cholas, the Satavahanas, and so on and so forth. And the problem of having a history written purely from the perspective of Delhi is that it introduces an even bigger bias into the entire story, which is that the story is told almost entirely from a continental perspective, which leaves out a very large proportion of Indian history, which is maritime. And indeed, much of Indian history cannot be understood without bringing out the maritime. And so this is really what I'm going to talk about today. Now, going back to the very beginning of Indian history, and of course, as you all know, that the beginning of historical the archaeology that is available, Indian history starts, of course, with the Harappan civilization. And of course, we learn in our textbooks all about the big swimming pool in Mohenjo-daro, and about long debates about whether they had horses or not, and so on. But what you don't hear enough about, I think, is the fact that the real source of growth and economic activity in the Harappan civilization came from the fact that they had these series of big ports all along the coast of Sindh and Gujarat. Now, this is not the Gujarat coast that you today see. It was a very different coast. What is Saurashtra, the peninsula today, was an island. And two major rivers flowed into what is now the Run of Kutch, the Saraswati and the Indus. And in there were a bunch of these islands. In particular, the island of Dholavira, which today is well inland, but was in fact originally a port. And from there, merchants set sail outward along the Makran coast, out towards the Persian Gulf. And there are many archaeological sites in Bahrain, in Oman, all the way through to what is now Iraq, where large numbers of Harappan seals, goods, etc. have been found. And in fact, you find that there was so much trade happening between the Gujarat Sindh coastline and the Persian Gulf that Indian measures, weights and measures, became the standard in the Bronze Age, that's about 5,000 years ago, throughout the Persian Gulf. And this is a long tradition which in fact ended only as recently as the 1960s. People may not remember that as recently as the 1960s, the Indian rupee was the main currency used as the national currency of countries like Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and so on. Now, as a result of this trade, we begin to see in Sumerian texts mentions of Indian immigrants. So there were already in the Bronze Age Indian communities called villages or enclaves living in Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, They, of course, were called Meluhans. And let me clarify to all the Malayalis here, those chaps are mostly Gujarati. And the very first mention of an Indian in a text outside of the subcontinent comes in a judgment made in a Sumerian court against a Meluhan who is fined several silver coins for having broken the tooth of a local in a drunken brawl. This, I presume, is the source of prohibition in Gujarat. Now, this kind of trade went on for a fairly long period of time, till around about 2000 BC, in which there was a cataclysmic shock to all the ancient civilizations in the world. It was a climactic shock. The Saraswati, which was already dwindling, completely dried up. You had the monsoon suddenly became much weaker. The ancient cities of the Harappans was abandoned and people wandered off. But this shows through incidentally also in the Sumerian cities which collapsed and the old kingdom in Egypt which also collapsed. So there was a complete collapse of the Bronze Age civilization around about 2000 BC. But then we see maritime activity pop up several centuries later on the other side, on the coast of what is now Odisha and Bengal. And a huge amount of trade begin to happen, and you begin to find Bengali and Odia merchants. Yes, there were such things as Bengali merchants. And they begin to explore the coastline. One group of them makes their way slowly down south along the coast, past the Andhra and Tamil coast to Sri Lanka. And this, incidentally, this story, mythologized of course, is remembered even by the Sinhalese in the story in the Mahavamsa of the king Vijaya, Prince Vijaya, who came there from Vanga or Bengal and settled. And the Sinhalese of today tend to take their lineage from that migration. But there was another group of these merchants which went the other way, which went along the coast and made their way along past Burma and to what is the Isthmus of Kra. That is the bit of Thailand from which Malaysia hangs off. Now notice that at this stage, this is in the 5th, 6th century BC, they were unable to cross the seas directly across because they just still hadn't mastered the monsoons. But so they were just going across as best as they could along the coast. And when they reached the Isthmus of Kra, they walked across to the other coast, and then from there, they again sailed out towards the Mekong Delta, what is now Cambodia and Vietnam, and made their way up the coast. And this is why, interestingly, you see Indian or Indianized kingdoms begin to pop up, first in Southeast Asia, not in Indonesia, which is much closer, but in Vietnam, southern Vietnam and Cambodia. And there's a fascinating story which is repeated in many inscriptions in that part of the world about how this came about. Now, difficult to tell whether it is true, but it is repeated in many, many inscriptions, so I think it is at least worth retelling. So the story goes as follows. It turns out that many centuries ago, and one can guess when, maybe the 4th century BC, there was an Indian merchant ship sailing past the Mekong Delta when it was attacked by a bunch of pirates. Now, on board the Indian ship was a Brahmin called Kaundinya. And he was a brave lad, and he rallied the troops, his crew, on board the ship, and they fought off the pirates. Unfortunately, what happened is that the ship developed some leaks. So they had to take it to the coast, and they had to beach it for repairs. When they were repairing the ship, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by the local Naga or serpent tribe. Now, this was a desperate situation. So here is this Indian merchant ship, beached. They are stuck there, very few in number, and they are surrounded on all sides by this Naga tribe. So again, Kaundinya rallied the troops to defend themselves when he hit a stroke of luck, which is this, that the leader of the Naga tribe was a warrior princess called Soma, or the moon-faced one, who saw Kaundinya and fell in love. And she sent a proposal of marriage to Kaundinya. Now at this point, Kaundinya, I suppose, did not have too much of a choice. So he accepted the proposal, the two married, and they set up a dynasty, incidentally a matrilineal dynasty. And for the next almost 1,500 years or so, all the dynasties which popped up in that part of the world, Cambodia and the Angkor kingdoms of Cambodia, and in southern Vietnam, the Chams, were these empires whose dynasties always tried to find their way back to that, how their lineage back to that original marriage between Kaundi and Soma. Now there is this is an interesting thing here, however, that this story is almost largely forgotten in India. But there is an interesting clue here, in that Kaundi, although it is not a common first name, is the name of a Gotra, a Brahmin Gotra, interestingly, which is found largely in southern Odisha and the Andhra coast, even today. So maybe, perhaps, there was really somebody from that Gotra who had actually gone there many thousands of years ago. Now this maritime expansion in India now expanded out very, very rapidly by about the 1st or 2nd century AD. India was trading on one side with Rome and all the way through to China, Japan, and even Korea by the 2nd, 3rd centuries AD. And so Korean history starts, as some of you may be aware, with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. Which is why Samsung is perhaps trying to circumvent various limits on FDI. Now this trade went back and forth and kept expanding very dramatically over the next several centuries. And by the time the 11th century turned up, there was a massive amount of trade going on between the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, the Cholas in southern India, and the Song Empire in China. And this trade went through two major channels through Southeast Asia. One of them went through what is called the Malacca Straits, which was controlled by the Srivijaya kingdom of Sumatra and Malaysia, what is Malaya. And the other was the Sunda Strait, which was largely controlled by the kingdoms of Java. Now things went all very well till about 1016, when the Javanese began to make raids into the Sumatrans. And the Sumatrans decided to ask for help from the Chinese. And so they declared themselves as vassals to the Song Emperor, who provided them with support. And with Chinese support, the Sumatrans pushed back the Javanese. And they were so successful that they ended up controlling not just the Malaccan Straits, which they traditionally controlled, but also the Sunda Strait, which the Javans used to control. And having done so, they began to extract very high tolls on the trade between the Cholas and the Song. So the Indo-Chinese trade suddenly was getting very highly taxed by ASEAN. Now, of course, the Cholas discovered that this was going on. And so you have Rajendra Chola, who repeatedly sends them warnings to the Srivijayas to stop charging high tolls. And ultimately, he led this huge naval expedition setting off from Nagapattinam in 1025 AD, and he sacked the major ports of the Sumatrans, and then swinging across, he met the main army of the Sumatrans in a place which is now in northern Malaysia, and he defeated them, and he came back, as a result of which trade was again restored. Now what is fascinating in all of this is that the Sumatrans had been very, very successful because they had support from the Chinese. But when the Cholas attacked them, the Chinese did absolutely nothing. We do not know exactly why this was the case, but they did not help their vassals at all. And we see shortly thereafter the Song Emperor receiving emissaries from the Cholas and the Srivijaya together. Now it's possible, of course, that the Song decided that it was too difficult to defend the Srivijaya, Or it's equally possible, I think the more likely, that the Chinese basically thought that these tariffs were inconvenient and they turned a blind eye. So this was a case of possible geostrategic maneuvering by the Indo-Chinese group against a troublesome fellow in Southeast Asia. So the point I'm trying to make is that India and China have been both trading, collaborating, and competing for geostrategic space for thousands of years. And these have gone in multiple directions at multiple times in very different ways. And much of this trade, interestingly, was not, as many people may think, done by individual merchants setting off in a ship on their own. By the time the Cholas appeared, this had become a multinational corporatized activity. So you have you see in the inscriptions across both southern India and also in Southeast Asia, these inscriptions of Indian merchant guilds, corporatized guilds. Some of them have names like the 500, which is obviously will go on one day to inspire an Indian equivalent of the Marvel comics. And this trade and these merchant guilds had not only big ships and fleets of ships, they had their own armies. And in many cases, they were powerful enough that you see them surviving several dynasties. So, dynasties will come and go, but these corporatized guilds will carry on. So I'm sure there will be some lecture in some future date on Indian contributions to the business to business history, and somebody will point out that perhaps the East India Company was inspired by Indians. Now, this trade, interestingly, was financed by temples. Now, nobody thinks of Indian temples being banks. But it turns out that one of the major reasons why the temples had such a lot of money was not just because the kings went and gave them a lot of grants. The real source of wealth of Indian temples in ancient times was the fact that they were essentially merchant banks. They were financing these expeditions and, of course, taking their pound of flesh when the merchants came back. And so what happened is that when during the Turkic invasions these temples were sacked, it did not only mean that there was a problem in terms of cultural loss. It completely paralyzed the financing of Indian trade both in the Arabian Sea and in the Bay of Bengal. And you see very quickly Indian merchant activity disappear from the ocean. And what is sad is that the response of this from the Indians of that time, and one can perhaps being judgmental, but what is sad is that the response was that Indians basically turned inward. They imposed on themselves the rule that crossing the seas was somehow a bad thing. And this way of thinking about the ocean, which had been such an intrinsic part of Indic civilization, suddenly India and its civilization turned its back on it. It's only really in the 19th century and really during with European shipping taking over the space that you see a revival of Indians again beginning to cross the seas, Indians as indentured laborers, as merchants and so on, begin to move into places like Mauritius, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. So this is really the history of the Indian in the Indian Ocean. It's a long, illustrious history. Sadly, for several centuries, it was buried first by this sort of fear of the sea that we developed starting from around about the 12th, 13th centuries. But then we forgot it entirely. And it's only in very relatively recent times that we have begun to dig up this history and begin to remember it again. And there's been, several books, one of them written by me, that has again begun to dig up this history. So one of the things I'm hoping to do, and I'm looking for a financier, is to build one of these ancient stitched ships. We have some idea of what they look like, and to finance me to sail it from somewhere along the east coast of India to somewhere in Southeast Asia. Thank you.